Okay, so part three, nutrient timing. So this is the third module in our Nutrition for Athletes course. Strongly recommend that if you are viewing this, it's because you've already had a look at understanding the roles of macronutrients. That's module one, and maybe even understanding the roles of micronutrients, module two. Although that one is probably a little less important for going ahead with this one. But definitely number one, macronutrition is a pretty important staple before taking on the nutrient timing module. And nutrient timing essentially is a fancy term for understanding and strategizing how and when to fuel with what types of fuel based on really how far away we are from the activity we're going to be doing, the type of physical exercise that we're going to be doing, how far away, and for the duration, the total duration of the activity we're going to be doing as well. So we're basically talking about the strategy and the science behind planning our energy intake so that it can be most beneficial to us. Athletes who understand how to do this properly for their specific situation, whether it's 50 or 60 minutes of high intensity work, or maybe 3 hours of moderate to high intensity work, or a full day tournament, or successive back-to-back matches, those kinds of things. Those are all different scenarios that merit different strategies when it comes to fueling, how much, how often, how incremental, all of those things. If we can do this well, obviously we can perform better, and we can also recover faster too. Because don't forget that nutrition plays a vital role in the effectiveness at which we recover. So let's look at this in three categories. Let's look at nutrient timing as a pre-exercise strategy. There's an intra-exercise strategy, and there's a post-exercise strategy. And again, depending on the type of athlete we are, the type of work that we do, these strategies should vary. So let's start here. Looking at pre-exercise, let's call pre-exercise nutrition as anything that is, between 24 hours right up to the 15-minute mark prior to training or competition starting. Our selections for pre-exercise nutrition are generally based on three variables. First, how intense the activity is. Second, how long the activity is going to last, the duration. And third, how close we are to the start of the activity. So how far away we are from it. So if these are our kind of pre-exercise considerations, this is maybe an ideal model. We might look at a day like this and say, okay, this athlete has a strength training session scheduled between 9:30 and noon. That's obviously going to have breakfast before it and hopefully lunch right afterwards. They have a soccer practice at 3:30 or 3 o'clock p.m. lasting till maybe 5:30 or 5 o'clock p.m. And that's obviously going to be followed by dinner. And then ideally, there's a healthy sleep in there, and there's the dotted line, and the cycle repeats itself. This is a perfect world that I'm well aware for 99% of student athletes does not exist, and in fact there's really no room for any of this stuff, which is the actual reality. We've probably got a bunch of regular scheduled classes in there between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. There's without a doubt a bunch of homework that probably needs to happen. There should be some time for a social life in there. I don't even have part-time work or any of the other things that might be kind of filling up the daily or the 24-hour rotation of the student athlete here. So I know that the hypothetical situation that I gave you before, I crowded it up with classes and homework and social life, is not very realistic. And what that really means is we need to be all the more considerate of what we need to do for nutrient timing's sake, because those strength training sessions and those sport specific practices probably still do exist somewhere in here. It's just a lot more crowded than we'd like it to be. So when we look at pre-exercise nutrition, let's try to isolate what's important. It's during this phase that we need to make sure that we're fueling with the right substrate, the one that we intend to rely on during the activity. And so for the most part, that's going to be carbohydrate. Carbohydrate providing us with that fuel for high, moderate to high intensity work. But again, remembering that our carbohydrate is coming at us in a range of complexities, going from extremely simple to extremely complex, or from fast to slow. So if the workload is going to be moderate or high intensity, we're looking at how are we fueling this from a pre-exercise standpoint with carbohydrate. We're probably going to want to rely on those slower carbohydrate sources when the activity is still fairly far away, and we're gradually going to shift to those simpler or faster sources as exercise approaches, as we get closer to it, right? So you should remember this from the first module that we did when we were introducing macronutrition. And again, this is not exact, but when I'm talking about as short as 20 minutes before exercise or physical activity begins, we're looking at those simpler carbohydrate sources, the oranges on the far left being a perfect example since they are 100% simple sugar. When we are more than 3 hours away, 2, 3, 4 hours away, or even longer, we're looking at more complex sources. On the far right are brown rice, which has absolutely zero simple sugar in it. A more complex chain takes a lot longer to break down and actually have an influence on blood glucose. So let's move on to intra-exercise nutrition. And when we're talking about intra-exercise nutrition, this is us discussing what we might be doing while we are training and competing to keep the fire burning, so to speak. And in the case of intra-exercise nutrition, we should probably state right off the bat that it's not always necessary. A training session or a competition that is shorter than 90 minutes doesn't usually merit an intersect exercise nutrition strategy. We could usually do without it as long as we're well prepared to kind of access a post-exercise nutrition strategy in the immediate aftermath. So if we're looking at an activity that is 75 minutes long or 60 minutes long, aside from having water, there's probably not much else we need, especially if we are prepared to have a pretty good post-exercise nutrition strategy coming at us very shortly after finishing. If though we are going to be doing something that's lasting, upwards of 90 minutes or a little bit longer, we have to make our selections for intra-exercise nutrition based on the intensity and the duration of the activity. So not unlike our pre-exercise nutrition considerations, but here is where we want to have a look at what we're fueling with and for what purpose. All right, and this is where some difference can actually occur. So what's important is that first of all, we make sure it's necessary. So beyond hydration, do we really need to be carrying anything with us during this workout? Do we really need to have calories going in while the workout is still happening or while the competition is still happening? And at this point, we kind of want to say in most cases, a vast majority of cases, in fact, we're going to be looking for simple carbohydrate. So if we've said yes to that first question, we do need to have some intra-exercise nutrition because this is going to be a 2-hour long session or something like that. We want something that's going to be able to be metabolized quickly and have an influence on blood glucose as quickly as possible. So it's usually at this point in the presentation, especially if I'm in a classroom where I'm asking students, who played house league soccer when they were younger, and I'm asking them, kind of reminding them maybe that each week maybe somebody's parents had a really important job to do, and they all took turns as the ones who brought something to the game, and that something was a halftime snack, and the halftime snack being more often than not sliced up oranges, and sliced up oranges were the perfect halftime snack. So whether we knew it or not, when we were 7 or 8 years old eating sliced up oranges on the bench at halftime in a soccer game, that was actually perfect nutrient timing strategy from an intra-exercise nutrition standpoint, because it was an extremely simple carbohydrate that could go to work for us really quickly, and essentially as soon as the whistle blew and we were back out on the field, those sliced up oranges were already going to work. The only exception to looking for simple carbohydrate alone as an intra-exercise nutrition strategy would be something like an endurance athletic event, so something that might last for several hours beyond its, the beginning or beyond that 90-minute mark. And in these cases, we'd actually be looking to use a complex carbohydrate as an intra-exercise nutrition strategy in addition to a modest amount of simple carbohydrate. So if we're looking at sporting events like the Tour de France, like cycling stage races that, each individual stage could be, a 5 or 6 hour long bike race. Sometime around the 65, 75 minute mark, you're going to see these endurance athletes starting to kind of take in some nutrition. And they're actually going to probably do this in the form of solid food. While they're sitting on their bike and pedaling up some mountain, they're going to be eating energy bars and other forms of solid food that are actually, for the most part, complex in their carbohydrate substrate level source, because they're looking to spend this energy in a little bit more sustained output, not necessarily spike blood sugar quickly to get them through the last 20 or 30 minutes. So these would be exceptions, endurance athletic events or things that last fairly long. The other exception, of course, would be a multi-competition event in a single day. So if you were a soccer player and you were competing in a tournament, we might refer to what you're doing between games. If you have six games or 5 games happening over the course of a day, like 6 mini games in an indoor tournament, if you're in between games and you're eating a complex carbohydrate source, that we'd probably be referring to that as intra-exercise nutrition as well, and that would make perfect sense. So those are probably the 2 exceptions beyond a simple carbohydrate, where you'd actually want to have a complex carbohydrate going in. And once again, it's these 2 here on the left. Those make perfect sense for pretty much any intra-exercise nutrition strategy, and it's all those other complex or partially complex carbohydrate sources that might make a little bit more sense in the event of an endurance event or a full day long event where there was multiple sessions of competition happening throughout the day. So our last category in nutrient timing is what we'll refer to as the post-exercise stage. And this is where we do have to, once again, kind of come back to dispel the myth that the most important and the vital and the only thing that we need to worry about in the post-exercise stage is protein. What's in fact true here is that we have to prioritize energy replacement. Okay, so if we're looking at post-exercise nutrition, we're gonna use it to refer to any nutritional intake that happens immediately upon the finish of exercise and up to approximately 1 hour afterward. And it is actually extremely important to get macronutrients into the body within 45 minutes or so of finishing exercise. And we want to basically make these selections based on 2 considerations. One, how much energy do we need to replace? How much did we basically just spend? And at what extent do we need to kind of focus on the repair and recovery of muscle that has been damaged? So we should prioritize energy replacement, meaning that in the immediate aftermath, carbohydrate is actually the most important thing here. The ability for amino acids and proteins to basically go to work on muscle fibers, to repair them and to synthesize new muscle fibers if we've kind of spiked a training stimulus there, it's only going to happen if we are also able to replace carbohydrate. If we rely solely on protein as a macronutrient and as an energy substrate in the immediate aftermath of exercise, the unfortunate outcome is that the protein is not going to do the job we think it's going to do, but rather instead that it's going to go through a terribly inefficient process known as gluconeogenesis, and you don't necessarily have to know what's happening there. In terms of what's going on at the molecular level, but essentially what's happening is that the amino acids that make up the proteins are being converted into muscle glycogen and blood glucose because we didn't give our body the carbohydrates that it needed to supply that muscle glycogen and blood glucose. So rather than allowing amino acids to go to work in their primary job of synthesizing new muscle fiber and repairing damaged muscle fibers, we're converting those valuable proteins, those valuable amino acids into what carbohydrate could otherwise very easily give us. So what's really important here, so number 1 priority is refuel. Protein can only do its job if the refuel is also happening. One of the kind of general guidelines we use here is we encourage athletes to use kind of a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio for the short-term refueling period. So if we're trying to aim to replace 50 to 60% of the approximate energy that we just spent, and that is a pretty good target, we're looking at something like the example of 400 calories, and 60 grams being carbohydrate and 15 grams being from protein and 10 grams being from fats. That would be a really well-balanced makeup of 400 calories. And 400 calories would probably be a pretty reasonable expectation of probably 60% replacement of an hour of hard work. An hour of hard work usually yielding anywhere between 650 and 900 calories of energy expense. So again, this is just an example here, but it is a good 4-to-1 example that would be a pretty easy to attain kind of value using just natural foods that are pretty easy to pack and bring along and have ready for the immediate aftermath of a workout. If we're looking at what that might look like, what a 4-to-1 might look like. There are some good examples up here on the screen, and there are some not so good examples. And again, if we were in a room of students right now, this is a good opportunity for some discussion and some interaction. But it's probably pretty easy to just have a look at this and pick out the ones that not to necessarily be a good blend of protein and carbohydrate with a little bit of healthy fat, and which ones probably do have a really good blend of protein, carbohydrate, and a little bit of healthy fat. It's these 4 right here that we'd probably want to say, yeah, these are definitely good post-exercise refueling choices. The 4 that kind of grayed out there, not so much. A low carb bar might be high in protein, but that protein can't do its job without carbohydrate. We know for sure a chicken breast, something like that, that's going to be almost entirely protein, no carbohydrate at all. Those almonds up top might be okay. They do balance protein, carbohydrate, and fats okay, but on their own, we wouldn't necessarily think that they would have enough carbohydrate in them. And we could say the same for a glass of milk. So those 4 that are highlighted in green would be the 4 best selections out of the 8 for sure. So if we've kind of had a look at those 3 categories now, the best thing to kind of show you before we move away from this module is what a nutrient timing really does mean for an athlete. And what it really does mean is meal planning. So if we take this example, and this is just one meal planning assignment that an athlete did a couple years ago and kindly shared with me after he did it. This is somebody who's kind of built 3 different days, hypothetical days for himself based on his known training sessions, knowing that he was doing a morning strength training session every day that was basically lasting about an hour. It was taking him through fairly moderate to high intensity work. And he knew he was spending about anywhere between 600 and 800 calories over the course of that hour. In the afternoon, he did have a sport-specific practice. It was either hockey or lacrosse, and it was lasting generally somewhere around 2 hours. Over the course of that session, he'd spend anywhere between 1,200 and 1,500 calories, and he'd be working at probably 50% of the time in anaerobic drills and another 50% of the time in less fatiguing oxidative situations. So after kind of building this up, what we really kind of wanted to do is make sure that he was not just fueling for the work that lied ahead of him, but that he was also fueling for the immediate aftermath or the refueling in the short term. And if you look at his lunch section there, that was actually probably his most calorie dense and energy dense period of the day, where he knew that it was extremely important for him to be refueling after that morning training session, and wasting no time making sure that he was preparing for the afternoon session that was coming up around 5 o'clock. So again, a pretty balanced meal plan. He did a pretty good job here, and I think that we can go a lot deeper than this. This is actually a pretty simple one. It doesn't actually show caloric values or the breakdown between protein, fat, and carbohydrate. On the back end, he did do a bit of math here. It's just not shown on the screen. But this is where we really want to look at how the food you're eating, the meals you're eating, are actually fueling what you're doing, and whether or not we can maybe make changes or should make changes. And sometimes there's a little bit of trial and error involved here. And that's probably the last thing I want to say when it comes to nutrient timing, is that this doesn't just come out and work perfectly the first time around. This is something that we need to work on. We might design something like this for ourselves based on what we've learned here today and based on what we already know about nutrient timing and meal planning. And after a week of not just using the meal plan that we've created for ourselves, but also logging some pretty valuable metrics after working out, things like, how am I feeling with respect to my post-exercise satisfaction? And the next day, how am I feeling with respect to my pre-training motivation? Maybe logging some loads. How are we hitting new personal bests? Are we making any real headway when it comes to the numbers that we're producing with training sessions? That's kind of the feedback that's going to help you decide whether or not your meal plan that you've created for yourself needs some fine tuning or some tweaking. So it's not just the information that we've kind of provided in this module, but it's also kind of working within your own abilities to do a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of logging, pre-exercise motivation, post-exercise satisfaction, and of course using the numbers that are being produced by your training sessions to kind of help you prove to yourself that this is working for you, or whether it might need a little bit of tweaking and a little bit of fine-tuning. And that's the end of part 3. So the last session in the Nutrition for Athletes 101 is nutritional supplementation. And this module, of course, if you have any questions or concerns about it, please don't hesitate to get in touch. My email address is there, and you can always reach out to me through the website, strongerbcss.ca. Thanks for watching. Happy training.